Hello, everyone.
Hi.
I am honored to be sharing the stage with you tonight to talk about your new workbook.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to this. I feel like our work is aligned.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I think what I wanted to start off with is I feel like every person in this room, everyone that's watching online, is a cycle breaker, whether they know that or not. And I'd love to hear how you define family cycle breaker.
The first person to do a new thing, and that new thing could be stepping outside of a historical problem in the family. It could be deciding to not have children. I remember a woman saying, I am the only person in my family who values marriage. She's like, my mom wasn't married, my aunts aren't married, my grandmother wasn't married, and to get them to understand being in a marriage and sharing life with a partner, that's breaking the cycle. So it's not always a bad break. It could be a healthy break, but deciding to do something different and needing support in other spaces, that's what a cycle breaker is.
I love that definition. I think it's so hard to be the person that goes first, right? And I feel like some people are wondering, is it worth it to take that step and what kind of challenges they might face?
Well, when you're a cycle breaker, I think you have to develop new sources of support. Sometimes that's in friendships, sometimes that's in online communities. You learn about new resources through reading books, but it might not be inside of that system. And that's heartbreaking for many of us, to want the support of our parents or our family members and to only be able to get it from a friend group or from an online platform. So it can be heartbreaking to be the first person to do a new thing, and it is worthwhile. You know, when you decide that, I want to be the first person in my family to go to college. Maybe I don't want to be this religion anymore. Maybe I want to, whatever that thing is, you have to find a new place for support. It doesn't always mean ending those relationships, but learning how to exist in them with these new ideas for your life.
So true. In your book, you talk about getting pushback from family members, right? Or them talking about like, oh, you're acting funny or you're acting different. How would you recommend that people deal with that?
Embrace it. Often what we tend to do is say, no, I'm not. And sometimes it's okay to say, you know what, I am a little funny acting. I am a little funny acting because I really deserve or think I deserve to be treated a certain way. So if yelling is the norm and I'm saying don't yell, I'm funny acting. I fit your definition. Sometimes it's embracing that perhaps from their perspective, what they're saying, it makes sense. We can feel something different for ourselves, and what we try to do typically is get people on board with this thing that they're unfamiliar with children having a voice. We're like, no, everybody in the family must understand this in order for me to parent a certain way. And it's like, they don't have to. They can all be in disagreement, and you can still parent in this way. It doesn't mean, gosh, they don't love me, they don't support you, but they still love you, and they have, maybe something to say about it, but it doesn't mean that you can't do the thing that you need to do. So often, it's really about us learning to sit in the discomfort of people not always agreeing with everything that we're doing and understanding that from their perspective, that might be a truth. Not the truth, but it's a truth.
Yeah, it's so hard, especially in family systems, I think, where you're used to everyone acting the same, right? And everyone always following the same mantras, the same rules, to be that person that steps out. And I find that when you are that person, you want everyone to join you on that change, right? To be like, okay, I want you to read the books. I want you to do this. And what do you do with people who don't want to change?
You let them be themselves.
So hard, though.
Yeah, I have to acknowledge that there are some things about me I don't want to change, even with, strong, encouraging words from people who love me. And other people are the same way. The thing that you find problematic, they may see as a high value in their life to be that way. And so it's not always about changing people as much as it can be about embracing them. And I think when we learn something new, whatever it is, if someone told me they had a certain type of car in a certain color, I'm going to see it everywhere. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a yellow Prius. There's a yellow Prius. There's a yellow. When we get new stuff, we're like, oh, everyone must know about this restaurant. They must know about this book. If they read this book and saw this line that I saw, it doesn't always work that way. I love reading books on my Kindle just so I could see where other people have highlighted. And I'd be like, that was not that good. that was not that good. I did it today. I was reading a book and I was like, why did 70 people highlight that?
Like, should I highlight that?
Sometimes I think that. Should I be highlighting this? Am I missing something? Right? But that's what we think. Like, in order for something to be good, everybody else has to think it's good too. When in actuality, it's still good for us. It was a great book. It's a great new concept, but it's for you. It may not be for the other people in your family to embrace. They may get the message a whole different way. They might be listening to a song and get a message. They didn't need to read that book, or they may never get the message.
So I'm glad you said that, because I think we have to talk about accepting the people who never get the message. And there are some people, you say this in your work a lot, like, that are just never going to change. They're not going to come around. And I'd love to know what your definition is of accepting your family as they are and what that process looks like.
It can look like not trying to make people change, but saying that this person prefers this, and in light of that, this is how I will engage with this person. It is seeing the situation for what it is and deciding how you want to show up, which I think is really hard. I think a lot of, the things that we talk about as therapists, it takes years for people to be able to process those things. Like, and my clients said all the time, like, oh, that's really easy. It sounds really easy. And it's like, I know it's really hard. I'm going to keep saying it to you. I'm going to keep saying it to you. And I think eventually, once you start to practice it, it'll get a little bit easier. But this, it sounds like, oh, yeah, you set this boundary with a person and that's it. But, these are people. It's complex. You have a history. You know certain things. You can look in their eyes and, oh, they said I said that. So you can tell certain things. And that makes all of the work that we do with people a lot harder because we're compassionate. So it's a wonderful thing that we care. It's wonderful that people aren't like, well, I don't care what people think about my boundaries. It's like, oh, that's a little weird. So it's good that you feel this apprehension and this like nervousness. It's like, oh, wow, you're a caring being. That's really good that you care. Now go and do it. Yeah.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think with acceptance comes this freedom to be like, this is who this person is. And now I can decide how I want to interact or not interact with them. And that can be so empowering, right? To be able to just live in the reality of who our family members are, whether we like that or not, it sounds like is what you're saying.
Yeah. I'm having a memory now of my mother having a friend who spoke very loud on the telephone. And I would answer the telephone. This was in the 90s. And it was just like, it was so loud. It's like, oh my gosh. And so I just knew once she started talking, pull the phone away from your ear a little bit. It's not to say to this adult woman, you are so loud. I mean, that's what I was thinking. But it's like, what can I do in this moment to engage in a way that would make me feel better. This person doesn't have to do anything. So if we accept them and they have these behaviors that are problematic, we have to change the way that we engage. And sometimes that means spending less time with a person. That means them maybe not coming to the event while everybody else is there. That might mean not sharing certain details of things in a certain way. And that's the part that's really hard for us, because the role that people hold in our lives, it means a lot. And what I'll hear is, well, it's my mother, they should. It's my sister, they should. And we need to think about this as a human being, and they can't.
Yeah. What you're saying sounds so much more empowering, right? Like when I hear that, I'm like, oh, okay, that's something I can do, rather than trying to change the other person or make them do something, which ends up being so exhausting and doesn't really ever work.
It doesn't stick.
Yeah.
It doesn't stick very long. I think people can try. They'll try, right? And then you notice like, oh, it's going back. They're going back to themselves. Then you have to remind them again, and then they'll try a little bit more, and then they go back to themselves because they really want to be themselves. That's really what they're trying to do. Yeah. They're not trying to commit to this new thing that you're trying to get them to do. Now, it would be beautiful if they could do that, and some people are willing to do that, but it can still be really challenging, and we have to repeat ourselves and be patient, and sometimes we just have to accept that this really isn't going to change.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're talking about is this period of awakening and developing awareness for problems, right? Which reminds me of a mutually shared favorite topic that we have, which is adult, child, and parent relationships. And I think this is one of those relationships where there can be a lot of conflict over awareness, and that's how those patterns get repeated. And I would love if you could talk about like how that lack of awareness can hurt those relationships.
You know, I think when you are surviving a childhood or just existing in it, it's not a lot of time to think about what's happening to you. And often you don't have the emotional capacity to talk about like, hey, does your mom do this thing? Or does your dad do this thing? You don't even know to ask those questions. And so when children, become adults and they get into the world and they meet friends and they start having these deeper conversations, or they're looking on Instagram or, whatever that thing is, it's like, oh, that's why I was doing this, because this thing, and you start connecting the stuff. And, you have a lot of people who want to go to their parents and they're like, look, here's a list.
Of all your transgressions.
Of all your transgressions. And parents are shocked.
Yeah.
They're shocked. Because you've had this mom or this dad, and in their head, they're like, I sacrificed so much. I remember not doing this thing so you could do this. Like, they have all these stories. And I think both of those things are true. In some ways, they sacrificed whatever they're saying they sacrificed, and you still needed everything on your list. When you take that to parents, it can be quite offensive, because they're like, oh my gosh, what are you saying about me? And it's like, well, I'm not saying that you're a bad cook. I'm just saying that you didn't spend a lot of time with me. And that can be hard to hear when you think you're doing a great job.
Yeah, it reminds me of the role of like defensiveness in these conversations, and learning on both sides to drop some of that defensiveness. So I'm wondering how you feel about responses like, I did my best.
I don't think it's a helpful response, but I see why people say it, because it's their truth. They did their best. It's not going to move this situation forward, but thank you for that information. Yeah,
Is that what everyone should say back to their
yeah,
parents when they
it's
say
like,
that?
yeah, yeah, like that was really great. You thought you were doing your best, but it was a C at best. You know, it wasn't A work. You know, I think sometimes humans are very protective. And when you say something about a person who really feels that they did their best, and maybe they don't have this context. You know, I think sometimes children feel like their parents have all this information they have and they've read all these books too and all of these wonderful things, and they come from a different system. They come from a different context, and they could have been looking at something that's much worse than what you experienced. And so from their perspective, you didn't have it so bad. You didn't have it so bad. And so they're like, I did the best I could. But it would be really helpful if a parent could say, tell me more.
Yeah.
What can I do now? How do you think that experience impacted you? I didn't talk to you about the divorce then, but I'm open to hearing about it now. One thing that I've learned from being a parent is that, well, I don't know, I feel like my children and maybe this era of children are just different. You know, they're more aware of their feelings. And I don't know if it's because I'm a therapist, but my kids are always telling me in real time, like, Mom, look at me. I'm like, oh my gosh, I would never say that to my mother. But, you know, they just have a different level of emotional expression. Yeah. And we have like a little session every day where, we just take some time and we go over their day and we talk, and, it's like, wow, like this is very different than how I was raised. And I think sometimes we don't recognize the importance of talking to our kids about their experiences with stuff, because we're experiencing stuff that we think is much bigger. This new kid coming to your class is not a big deal when I'm trying to move this money from this account to make sure that, right. Which is a really big adult problem. However, to a 6-year-old, the new kid in their class is as big as you moving that money from this account to that. It's as big. They don't have context of this big adult thing you're happening in your life right now. And if we could just talk to kids about their experiences, even when we're putting them through this stuff. How do you feel about the divorce? What do you think about, grandma passed? I mean, it's so many kids I've worked with where the solution has been, okay, grandma died, I'm taking them to therapy. Have your parents talked to you? No, they won't talk to me. They just go in their room every day and close the door. Well, it's wonderful you talk to me once a week, but the other hours, I'll have to talk to your mom about talking to you. Yeah, so I think sometimes as adults are experiencing things, we don't validate the way in which our children or kids in general are experiencing things.
It's so true, and it's important to remember what that felt like for you as a child, right? When things felt so big and so overwhelming that you just wish an adult could have been there to be like, oh, it makes sense why that is so big. And I think we're talking about this group of adults who has like the list, the performance review for their parents, right? And then on the opposite side of the coin, I find there are a lot of adults who are very resistant to be honest about their childhood or to investigate it because they feel like that would be rude or an insult to their parents. And I'm wondering, what is the value in adults being really honest about their childhood, and how can they explore that while also embracing the good that their parents did do?
When we don't evaluate, we are living out those things in ways that we don't realize, whether it's our friendships or our marriage, the way that we parent our children. We're not being very thoughtful. We're not being intentional. We are making sometimes the same mistakes because we haven't even recognized the things that weren't good for us. And so just going through the motions of figuring out how you were impacted by things can really transform your life in a positive way. And I know a lot of people are afraid because they want to keep the family relationship. So if I talk about this thing and then if I admit that this person was emotionally abusive to me, I can't talk to them anymore. And so I don't want to talk about this. And really you don't have to end the relationship. You can acknowledge that thing and continue in the relationship. You don't have to cut it off. That's a choice. How are they treating you today? You mentioned that people are giving their parents performance reviews. And I think with that, you have to give them an improvement plan. Because a performance review with no improvement plan is not very helpful. And when we tell people all the problems and we don't let them know, okay, here's what I need now. I know you never said I love you when I was a kid and it's something that's uncomfortable for you now, but I will be saying it to you and it will be so loving to me if I could just hear it back. I know you love me, right? I know you love me, but I would love to hear you say it.
I love that. I think that's good advice. And it's important, right, to name the things that we want from our family members. Something that I really worked on in this work that was so difficult for me was acknowledging my own role in maintaining the dysfunction in my family relationships. I think it's far easier to kind of point out what everybody else is doing, but not look at yourself. And I'd love if you could speak more about like what that process might be like to wake up to how you might be participating in dysfunctional dynamics.
Self-accountability. Yeah, it's really easy to say that this person is doing this thing, that person is doing this thing, and they're all triggering and they're all doing this stuff. And meanwhile, we're doing some stuff too. And I think that's what workbooks and therapy helps you to discover, like, what role do you play in the chaos? Because you have a role too, even if your role is being silent. You may need to speak up. Even if your role is speaking up about everything, maybe you need to be a little more quiet. So there is, something that you're doing. It's like, oh my gosh, I hate when my mom gossips about my siblings, but you gossip about them. So it's recognizing, like, here are the things I'm doing that I need to move away from. I've noticed sometimes with siblings who have, interesting experiences with their parents, it's a lot of trauma bonding. A lot of, well, they did this and they did that and they did this. And it's like, you're in the cycle. And so you may have to do something different. You may have to try to connect on different topics other than your parents. You might have to talk about what you're watching on TV with this person and not always focus it on the pain that was inflicted in childhood, because now you're in the cycle with them.
Yeah, and sometimes we're maintaining dysfunction, right, by being even too helpful, by getting in the way. I know you talk about this in your book of like stepping in with people too often that they don't learn how to help themselves or do things for themselves. I think that's a really hard pattern to recognize because it feels good to help. We're being nice and noble, and you can get trapped into that role as well.
And sometimes we put ourselves in that role. We've been praised for being there. You're such a good helper. You always know what to say. Your mom always listens to you. Your dad, you're just so wise. You're old beyond your years. Like all of these things, and you just naturally get into this role. And I think sometimes, have we thought about if help was asked for? Was the H word used? Did someone say, I need help, or did you offer help because you thought they needed help? People very often can work through stuff. And maybe your job in this situation is to listen. And if they have a problem, I know this sounds wild, but just allowing them to talk to you about the issue without issuing that. Have you thought, if you find yourself, have you thought about, try this, maybe you could, perhaps, don't say any of that stuff. Just listen to the problem and, you know, watch a few episodes of Frasier, get some good head nods going, figure out what therapists do. Just, wow, that sounds like a big work issue. It's like, I don't have to do anything here. Nobody asks me for anything. They're just telling me an issue.
Yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb and say anybody that bought tickets to this and is here might need that advice because we tend to be the ones that are trying to be helpful, you know?
Well, you know, one really helpful thing is maybe to come up with a solution and just don't share it. just
so
wait for them to ask for it. Because the best solution that will work for that person is often what they'll come up with. I'm often shocked by how people will reject our help because it's not anything they would do anyway. And so you're like, you could do this, you could just, and they're like, oh no, I tried that, and then we get so upset, oh, this was the best. Let them figure out what they'll do. It might be a whole different thing, or it might be nothing. Sometimes people just want to complain and have the problem.
This is true.
Let them have a problem.
Yeah, we have to get more comfortable with not trying to fix everything for everyone, and it can be hard to step out of that role, for sure. Something I really wanted to talk to you about today is forgiveness. I think forgiveness in families is such a huge concept. We're often asked to forgive people for things in our family that we would never be asked to forgive outside of the family. And I'm wondering, like, do you see forgiveness becoming toxic in dysfunctional family systems?
Well, I think it depends on what the forgiveness means. If the forgiveness means forgiving and forgetting, then I think that can become toxic. If it means forgiving and holding a person accountable, forgiving and deciding how to move forward, forgiving and, you know, moving through life with a lighter heart, and maybe not having the relationship or having the relationship, you know, what does the forgiveness mean to you? The forgiving and forgetting is the toxic part because we don't forget. I have, you know, talked to clients, 80s, 80 years old, and they're sharing these stories they were supposed to forget. When I was a little girl, I'm like, what year was that, ma'am? Oh, okay. They have not forgot. We don't forget stuff, and if we do, that's a problem. Now we need some other help. We remember this stuff. And so the forgetting part, it's not even possible. It's not even possible. I can forgive you and see that maybe you were in a place of pain and, you know, maybe we can work through this, but I can't forget about it. The forgetting about it causes resentment. I think it causes lots of health issues. It causes lots of passive aggressive behaviors. There's nothing like a family getting into a fight and this thing from many years ago is just thrown in there. It's like, what? What just happened? Yeah, because we haven't actually forgotten.
Yeah, I find that it's often the person who maybe did the hurtful thing that wants the forgiving and the forgetting, right? It serves that person the most.
Yeah. I think you have to allow people to hold you accountable, and you can't expect them to always feel good about the pain that you caused them. And there may be times where they want to talk to you about it or they want to bring that thing up. And you have to allow that if you have the relationship with them, because their forgiveness of you is not about your comfort. You have to be able to sit with the things that you did. That's a part of being accountable. You don't get to pick and decide what people forget and how they feel about those things. Oh, it wasn't that big of a deal. That was years ago. And it's like, I still have issues with that. Whenever, and many times people have a story. Whenever blank happens, I remember this thing. And so the forgetting, it's like it's coming up in other ways, and I just want to process this with you.
I think that's the part that we also forget about, is that even if it's not coming up necessarily and like you remember the story, it's showing up in other ways in your life, right? Whether that's in drinking, eating, your sleep, that sometimes our body doesn't forget what we experienced.
And our body wants us to acknowledge what's going on. My practice gets rather busy around big holidays. Why? People are now having sleep issues, gastrointestinal issues, more migraines and headaches, eczema flare-ups, and just all sorts of things because they have to go to a family gathering. They have to, the drinking increases, the drug use increases, all of the things start to happen, and it's like, what might this behavior be trying to say?
Right.
It may not be saying, hey, don't go home and have your mom's macaroni, but it could be saying there is a conversation that needs to be had before you go. So the same thing that happened last year doesn't happen again. Right. Because without talking about it, it's going to be a repeat. And I have some people, it's a repeat. And, that Monday after Thanksgiving, I'm like, what'd your sister do? She did it again. It's like every year. Yeah. It's like, show me a picture of her. I just want to know who we're working with. I want to see this sister.
Ask for a picture.
I have asked for pictures. I'm like, I want to know who I need to ignore at Trader Joe's. Loyalty.
It's making me think about, especially around the holidays, we engage in a lot of fantasy making about our families, right? Like, this year it's going to be different. Everyone's going to get along and they're going to be happy together. And I don't know, do you see that, and how do you get people to kind of move out of that fantasy?
We prepare. I am very clear that without anything being different, you're going to get a similar experience. And so if you want something different, you will have to do something different. And if no one else knows, it's on you. Did you talk about the thing that happened last year? Or was it just like, oh, that's what happens every year? What's going on conversation-wise? What's been going on throughout the year? People have these tumultuous relationships. And then, when a family member is in a hospital, you expect Aunt so-and-so to finally have some sense. And then she come to the hospital with no sense. And everybody's shocked. I can't believe she ain't had no sense at the hospital. It's like, she doesn't have sense on a Tuesday. So I don't know why you thought at the hospital she would be better.
Right. Yeah.
Will anyone talk to her ever? But it's, it is this grand expectation that people are going to have this miracle shift from nothing. Like nothing changing in their life, but they will change.
Yeah, they've done no therapy, done no work, but they're suddenly going to be a different person on Thanksgiving. Yeah, I can see how easy it is to get trapped in that fantasy, because it would be nice if it was that easy for people to change. We would be out of a job and it would be so much easier for people. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, family secrets and shame. I think a lot of people are living in families where they've been told, we don't talk about X. This stays within the family, and it can be uncomfortable to start talking about that stuff. How do you recommend that people navigate some of those things they've been told to keep quiet about for so long?
I think first it starts with acknowledging it yourself. Sharing it with people you trust, whether that's friends, or, family members who are safe, and then speaking about those things as if they are real and not trying to hide those things. The amount of people who don't acknowledge even alcoholism in their family. I've seen clients for years, and year 8, they're like, yeah, because my dad was an alcoholic. I'm like, wait a minute, what? I never knew that. But they're ready to talk about it, right? And it's like, oh, okay, so this thing happened and you're ready to talk about it now. Or they'll say things like, this person drinks a lot, and it's like, drinks a lot? Like, how many drinks is that? Does everybody drink a lot? Like, what does that mean? But that's the way, families will help you hide these secrets. They will have their own language around it. You know how so-and-so gets when they have their juice. Juice? I've never had any juice that makes me act like that. Is that a Capri Sun?
And that person's like 65.
And they're 65. What juice are they drinking? Is it Mott's? It's very interesting the way in which we can cover up dysfunctional behavior because we're not ready to address it. Yeah. And so just the power of you saying, he's having a beer. We're not going to call it juice. We're gonna. Mom is not taking her medicine. She's taking a pill that she doesn't need.
Right. Yeah, I think that's so the power of therapy, right? To be able to be in a room where you can say some of these things out loud and have someone sit with you and say, okay, that shouldn't have happened, or that's not something that you should have been forced to keep a secret for all your life. Like, just being able to say that thing out loud can be so transformative in itself.
Yeah, and people need support. I think when you try to break these cycles in isolation, you get to a stuck point because you're like, oh, is this really that big of a deal? I mean, all these you need people to encourage you and to say, no, that wasn't okay. And you may need to hear that over and over for you to get the courage to really believe. Because you've been in this family system that is saying, this is normal behavior, this is okay, we don't talk about this thing, don't tell anyone this. And so you need the help of a therapist, you need a workbook, you need a friend group, you need people to help you on your journey.
I totally agree. So we have some good audience questions. Are you ready to get into those?
Yes.
All right, let's do it. Okay. So how do you know if you're avoiding drama or avoiding conflict, which can be silencing of yourself? So I think, how do you know if you're avoiding drama, avoiding the conflict, or if you're just staying out of it, it sounds like?
Does it involve you? Because some drama that's happening, it really doesn't have anything to do with us. It could be our parents and their relationship. It could be our siblings or our parents with their siblings. So what is being brought to you? Is this something that you want to be stopped? Or is there a statement that needs to be made? Sometimes with avoidance, we're actually not avoiding because we've made a statement of, hey, I don't want to participate in this, or this is the thing I think about this thing, or please do not X, Y, and Z. So there has been some statement made about your position. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily avoidance. But if you're like, oh my gosh, all this chaos is unfolding and I'll just be quiet, then that might be a little bit of avoidance. So I would say, what is your intention? What have you done? Have you set any boundaries? Have you talked about this with one or more people involved? And if you've done those things and you're just like, you know what, from now on, I won't get in it. Maybe it's not avoidance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to kind of do that check to see what your role is in the problem. All right, I like this question. You talk a lot about what we can do to accept others without trying to make them change, but what responsibility does the other person have to engage with us in ways that we feel comfortable with?
It is hard to determine another person's responsibility level. We can have that desire, but we can't necessarily make them do anything. Now, if they want to be in relationship with us, we can have the expectation that they respect certain things about our space, about our bodies, about the way that they communicate with us, but we can't make them do anything differently. But hopefully, you know, with healthy folks, I don't think it's always problematic to have those conversations. I think when you're getting a lot of pushback sometimes, maybe we don't even recognize that people have their own trauma. They have some mental health issues that haven't been addressed. Yeah. And so we're trying to go to people who have all of these challenges where it's like, yeah, what you're saying, it isn't going to be that helpful because they have a deeper issue that is beyond you.
Yeah, I think this fits in really well with our conversation about acceptance, right? That people do have a responsibility, but you're saying sometimes they can't fulfill that responsibility, right? And so we have to say, okay, with the way this person is behaving, how do I want to interact with them now if they cannot fulfill that responsibility? It's a hard position to be in, for sure.
It is.
All right, next question. What do you recommend for people who are easily triggered by family, in parentheses, parents, they see often?
What do you recommend? I would suggest noting what makes you feel triggered. That's the first thing. And those might be the things you need to talk about with your parents. Sometimes we want to be in relationships, but we don't want to do any work on the relationship because we may feel like this other person, they won't hear us, they see us as their child, they won't do these things, and we don't know. I don't know what episode of Oprah your mom watched today, but she might be in a changing spirit today. You know, you don't know until you have that conversation. And then I think about that you see often. Why? Why do you see people often that you feel constantly triggered by?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
This is a good expansion on something that we just kind of talked about. How can I manage anger and guilt when dealing with parents with mental health issues?
I would say educate yourself on your diagnosis. The more information that you have about a personality issue or anxiety or depression, it won't excuse their behavior, but it will help you to understand some of the things that they're going through. I remember a woman whose mother was schizophrenic, and the level of compassion she had for her mother was just so amazing. You know, she was like 19 and she lived on her own and she helped care for her mother. She's like, you know, my mom just can't do it. It was so much acceptance around, you know, my older brother had to step in and raise me. Like, my mom just doesn't have the skill. It's not even a requirement that I can have for her because what she's dealing with is beyond parenting. She is seeing things that are not present. She is hearing things. You know, so when you understand what a person is going through, you can take yourself out of the equation. This isn't about me. This is a bigger thing than me. And how can I be compassionate? How can I, you know, maybe help them in some cases? How can I explore this with them? I think the bigger challenge is when you assume your parent has a mental health issue and they don't have a diagnosis.
Or they deny it.
Or they deny it, or they won't go to treatment. You know, I've heard people say, like, my mom went to the doctor once and they told her she was bipolar and she said that's not true. It's like, okay, they may have been onto something. A lot of what you're saying sounds like maybe that is the case. But, you know, you do have people who will be like, nope, that's not true. And they don't want to take any medication, or they don't want to see a therapist, or, you know, they're really rejecting of what that diagnosis is, which makes it hard for a person to empathize because you're not trying to get any help.
Yeah, it's reminding me of what you said earlier about the holidays and sort of living in that reality of like, if my mother has schizophrenia, if I know that she has this set of symptoms, I can come to expect it and prepare for it, which makes me feel less shock, when it does happen. And what you're saying is also reminding me of like that term of ambiguous loss, of like grieving this person that is alive that may have a mental health issue, and grieving that loss of like maybe the parent you wanted them to be in real time because they just can't fulfill that role.
Yeah.
Right. How does one navigate in uncomfortable spaces where there's tension with family members, for example, funerals?
I think preparation, as you spoke about, preparing for the event, going for the event and deciding how long you want to linger. With funerals, sometimes there's a repast or, a burial or all these sorts of things, and you can decide what your time limit can be, how much you can take. Maybe you go and view the body and you don't go to the funeral. So I think thinking about how you want to show up in that space. Now, of course, during a funeral, you can decide to sit by yourself, and you can, maybe leave a few minutes early so you don't have to engage, but really figuring out how you want to be a part of these events without getting overwhelmed by the interactions could be really helpful.
That preparation is so important. This person is wondering your perspective and any advice for working with clients once they have developed acceptance and adjusted their expectations/boundaries using the options under their control, but they continue to struggle with guilt, self-judgment, and thoughts like, I should be able to tolerate their behavior, or I'm being selfish.
I'm hearing a lack of support from their environment. And the only place that person might be receiving that support is in the therapy space. They may need more people in their life to encourage them. Have they been honest with other people about what their situation is? And if so, if people are healthy, they will validate that experience for them. So I'm hearing a need for more support outside of the treatment space. When you're in a family and everyone is committed to the dysfunction, right? And you're the person's like, oh no, this thing is not what it should be. But you go back to the family and you're like, look guys, look at all these things. It's like, they're all in it. Yeah. So it's very hard for them to see it. Sometimes we don't see stuff until we're like further back from it. That's why we think about our childhood so much as adults, because we're like out of it. And so you can like look at it and be like, oh my gosh, like I didn't even know this thing, or, have information about what was healthy or what wasn't healthy. Hindsight is like, wow. And that happens in our families. And sometimes when people they're in that situation, that is their norm. People don't even know that chaos is unhealthy sometimes because it's the norm. I've heard people say, everyone in my family yells, and that's why I yell. It's like, but you're in a quiet space. And so once you're away from that and you realize, wow, everybody's family is not yelling, you now have the ability to think about, do I want to yell all the time? But you may not know that if you're around all this dysfunctional stuff, because everyone there thinks that it's normal. I started watching this show, Vince Staples, and it's on Netflix. And one of the things he talks about is how violence in his neighborhood was so normal. Like he would talk to people and everybody knows somebody who was shot or this thing or that thing. And it took for him getting out of that environment. And something happened, he was doing some interview and he was telling his manager about it, and his manager was so compassionate, like, oh my God, just having this reaction. And he's like, why is he reacting like this? Because in his environment, that's very normal. He was like, this was the norm for me. And it took me like looking at this guy's face to be like, wow, he's really having a reaction to this thing that I talk about with my friends and I talk about with my family. So sometimes us getting away from it is when we're able to see, wow, that was not okay. And if we're talking about it with all these people who are experiencing and they're still in it, they may not understand the severity. So our expectation of them should really change. We shouldn't even expect them to see things our way because they are in it.
That's such a good reminder. All right, let's end with one last question. We talked about forgiveness a little bit, but this person's wondering, can you define the action of forgiveness and what that means? So maybe what the process of forgiving looks like.
I would say change behavior and consistency and a willingness to be accountable. You know, sometimes when people are forgiving others, they think that conversation is the forgiveness. If we have this conversation, this is the forgiveness. And it's like, that's not the forgiveness. That's just a conversation about them doing this thing and hopefully them owning it. And again, we can't just give the performance review without having like a plan of action. So I forgive you for this thing, and going forward, moving forward, this is what I would like to see. This is what I need from you. When I bring this topic to you, I need you to hear me. I need you to listen to me. I don't want you to share this with other family members. I want this to be between us. And we can learn to trust again when a person is consistently doing this thing that they said that they will do. If they break that, then we unforgive them. We're back in the cycle of, I gotta forgive them for this same thing again. And I know in families there is, you know, this idea that we all have to be together. We all have to, you know, have this sort of strategy, and it's us against the world. And if that is the case, I think what should come with that is kindness, compassion, caring. And sometimes we're not showing that within the family. We'll show that in the world. We'll give that to other people. We can be really nice to our friends, but who are you at home? Who are you with your people? You know, that aunt that's loud, she is probably just as quiet at work. So it's in there. You know, you have the ability to be a flexible human being. So you can practice that here. We don't have to accept anything. You know, we want you to be yourself to some extent.
Within reason.
We've taken be yourself and be authentic way too far. It's like, just be your authentic self. It's like, please don't. Please don't be your authentic self.
Much.
Not that much. Like 20%.
Such a good reminder. Well, Nedra, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. This was wonderful, and I think you offered everyone here some really great, solid advice. I know I am going to take some of it myself. So thank you again for having me.
You're welcome.